Hey everybody, it's Seth.
Hi, it's Becky.
And we are taking some time off to retool the podcast.
It's going to be new, improved, fresh, with lots of great new elements, and we're going to relaunch in January.
Yes, so until then, because you're a loyal listener, we want to go back into the archives and bring back some of these episodes that we think you might like.
We've had some great interviews over the last couple of years, and we want you to hear them.
Here's one right here.
Enjoy.
Check, 1, 2, 3.
The D.
Brief.
This is the D Brief.
Your guide to Detroit.
Your guide to Detroit's
Arts and entertainment scene.
This is the D.
Brief.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm your co-host. My name is Seth Ressler.
And I'm Becky Scarcello.
And Becky, we talk about music a lot.
We sure do.
On this podcast. And of course, when people think of Detroit, they often think of Motown. I was thinking about it right there.
Yeah.
They think of Motown. Sometimes they think of techno.
Sure.
We'll talk about that. Maybe, I don't know, white boy rap with Eminem and Kid Rock and all that kind of stuff. Jazz does not come to mind first for most people, except this time of year when we've got the Detroit Jazz Festival, right? But there's actually a big history.
Definitely.
Here in the city.
And it weaves into so much of Detroit's overall history, where people lived, where they did things, what was happening in the political climate. Jazz weaves through it all.
And I'm going to confess, it's not my genre. It's not something that I necessarily know a lot about, so I'm always learning. And I thought especially this year, it's the 40th Detroit Jazz Festival that they've had. So leading into this weekend, we've got a great guest on the podcast today, Mark Stryker. He was the music and arts critic and reporter for the Detroit Free Press for over 20 years, and he has a new book out. It's his first book. It's called Jazz from Detroit. How perfect is that? Book came out in July, so we're very excited to have him here. Mark, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, welcome.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So let's talk about the book, and let's talk about the history of jazz in Detroit. When does it really start, and when does it begin to flourish?
Well, I think the first thing to say, even before we sort of get to the specifics, is just in general, bouncing off your introduction, jazz often is not the first thing that people think about when they think about Detroit music. And yet, what people need to understand is that Detroit had this extraordinary jazz legacy and was producing jazz musicians well before Motown. And then it was producing extraordinary musicians all during the Motown years. Jazz musicians, and Detroit has been producing great jazz musicians since Motown left.
Yes.
Are they largely separate worlds? I mean, do musicians move? Did they move between?
They're largely separate worlds. Some of the, of course, famously, some of the Motown session musicians were basically jazz musicians, but they were largely moving in separate worlds. And the theme of the book is that you cannot tell the history of jazz in America without also telling the history of jazz from Detroit. That those two things are basically indivisible, because the number of influential jazz musicians that have come from this city is extraordinary. And now, to your question, it really gets going in the middle of the 1940s and the 1950s. There is sort of an explosion of modern jazz here in Detroit. And we begin producing musicians like Hank Jones, Thad Jones, and Elvin Jones, brothers from Pontiac, who basically came up here in Detroit, and trumpeter Donald Byrd, and trombonist Curtis Fuller, and Yusef Lateef, a saxophonist, and Kenny Burrell, a guitarist, and Paul Chambers and Doug Watkins and Ron Carter, very important bass players, and Louis Hayes, a drummer. And I mean, it's an extraordinary list of musicians that sort of come of age in the 1950s. The pianist Barry Harris and Tommy Flanagan and Roland Hanna all come up in Detroit. And, there are, I think, some important social, economic, and cultural reasons why jazz becomes a center for this music in the middle of the 20th century. And there are reasons why Detroit continues to produce great jazz musicians over the decades, even when, or in the midst of the decline in Detroit's economic power and it's the decline in population. Somehow the city manages to sustain this extraordinary jazz legacy. So the book really tackles these questions of how did Detroit become such a center for the music, and then how do we sustain that over the many decades? And I tell that story in several different ways, looking at those issues specifically, but also the guts of the book are really, about 26, 27 individual profiles of many of the most important musicians that came from the city. So it's in a way, it's a mosaic by telling these individual stories of these important musicians and tracing their lives on and off the bandstands and their most important recordings and associations, and giving people a sense of the characters that they are and how they glide through their lives and live their lives. In doing that, and you add all of those things together, you see this bigger portrait of how important Detroit is, and you begin to connect, and I connect dots between musicians and between eras.
Can you set the scene for us? I mean, what would it have looked like in the 50s? What neighborhoods are we talking about? What are the clubs? What's the jazz scene like back then?
Well, the jazz scene is roaring in the 1950s. The first thing you have to remember is Detroit is roaring in the 1950s, right? Detroit has our peak population in the early 1950s is nearly 2 million people. And more than 300,000 of those people are African Americans. And jazz, it's an expression of African American culture, thrives where there are a variety of things that are happening. One of the most important is you have to have the people there, but you also have to have a thriving economic base that creates this thriving nightlife. And in Detroit, in the 1940s, in Paradise Valley in the city, which was a historic center of African-American economic life, there were hundreds of bars and restaurants and hotels and opportunities for musicians to work. And in the 1950s, there were scores and scores of important modern jazz clubs like the Bluebird on the west side on Tireman and Klein Show Bar over on the west side on 12th Street and many other places where the music was thriving. So, again, let's back up a little bit. Detroit. Detroit and jazz basically grow up together in the early part of the 20th century, and Detroit is a great example of the profound impact of the Great Migration. As millions of African Americans moved from the South to the North, seeking better jobs, better economic opportunities, less overt discrimination. They flock into Detroit, and Detroit is, because of the rise of the auto industry in the early part of the century, Detroit is offering some of the best wages for African Americans in the country. So Detroit is on the cutting edge of creating a black working and middle class in this country. And so what happens is that economic, the growth of the black working and middle class creates this thriving nightlife and creates the opportunities for the music to flourish. So that's as a baseline what happens. Then we have extraordinary public schools in Detroit who have some of the best music programs in the country, and we'll talk about this more maybe in a little bit here. But so you have the economic impact of the auto industry. You have the impact of great public school music education, which are training all of these musicians to play their instruments. And then you have very important mentors in the community, older jazz musicians, in some cases just a little bit older than the students they're teaching, who are jazz is an oral art form. It's an oral tradition, and so you're getting the education of the streets. So the combination of the economic thriving nightlife in Detroit, the public school music education, and the mentors in the community, and the opportunity for kids, young musicians to perform at night, that's a very powerful combination and goes a long way to explaining why Detroit has this explosion of modern jazz in the 1950s. And there are other reasons too. We can talk about those too. We have very sophisticated audiences here, and that has a big impact. There's a kind of a familial attitude among the musicians and the audiences here that you don't get everywhere. We have kind of very high standards here, so there's big city competitiveness, but kind of a small town nurturing atmosphere. And all of these things sort of come together to create this explosion in the middle of the 20th century.
It sounds like also, though, you tried to make this book a little bit more maybe not exactly like a novel, but more about the stories of the characters, as you say. So it's not just like a list of the clubs and the facts, but it's like I can just hear through your voice the passion of the stories behind that. And so it sounds like it's a real interesting read to take a peek back at this time.
Well, I hope so. I mean, the idea was with these important musicians, was to create a sense of their lives and create the characters on the page, right? A good writer, whether you're working in fiction or nonfiction, you're creating a character on the page for people. And so I take people, I try and bring together all of the things that I've been doing for much of my career, which is, meticulous reporting, scholarship, music criticism, lively writing, setting scenes, creating character, and create individual stories that are compelling. If we can talk about some of the people, you tell me what you'd like to. What would
I'd
you
love
like
to hear about some of the mentors.
I know, yeah, and how, because I think that still goes on today. You talk just about somebody like Marcus Belgrave, and then you speak to young musicians and how many of them took lessons from him or met him at shows and just carried on that tradition.
Yeah, the mentorship angle here is very important and is a really critical piece of the puzzle about why Detroit and how Detroit manages to sustain its jazz tradition. In the 1950s, the most important mentor in the community was a pianist named Barry Harris, kind of a professor of bebop. Is the way I talk about him. And Barry is he's almost 90 years old, still teaching in New York and still playing. And very much in the same way that he was teaching in the 1950s out of his house on the west side, near right around the corner, basically, from the Bluebird where he was playing. And so Barry ran basically a kind of Socratic workshop in his house, and he would sit at the piano and young musicians would sort of gather around him, and Barry would talk about what he was working on, and we'd show them these young musicians, teach them tunes and show them scales and harmony. And basically Barry was creating a theory about how the vocabulary of bebop was sort of put together. And these ideas actually become very influential and found their way over the years into mainstream jazz education as jazz education got going in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s and beyond. But Barry was doing this back in the 50s. And at the time, Barry was born in 1929, and he starts teaching people basically around 1950, 1951. And so he's just a few years older than people like Donald Byrd, the trumpet player, or Paul Chambers, the bass player. And so, Barry's in his early 20s, and these kids are late teens, mid-teens, and Barry's already teaching them. And, Barry would be playing at the Bluebird, and he would, at the time, the stage at the Bluebird was kind of right on the front window, right by the door. And so a young musician like saxophonist Charles McPherson was about 15 years old in 1954 when he was started to hang out in front of the Bluebird, and Barry would come out and we'd see the kids, and he'd come out and he'd see them on the breaks, and he started to talk to them and learned that they were interested in the music. And so he'd go back in, and when he'd play the next set, he'd leave the door open with the screen open so that the kids could hear the music. And the kids kept coming back. And so Barry at one point said, well, why don't you come over to the house? And so then Charles and his buddy, Lonnie Hillier, a trumpet player, both 15-year-olds, they started going over to Barry's house every day and after school. And so and Barry would start teaching them. And so Barry would adopt these kids basically. And I tell you, a really powerful story for me, and it's in the book, is that not all of these lessons that Barry was teaching had to do necessarily with music. And one day, Charles was over, and Barry saw that Charles had his report card, and he said, "Oh, hey, can I see your report card?" And Charles said, "Yeah, sure." So he gives him the report card, and it's like all C's. And so Barry sort of looks at it, and with a kind of a little bit of a disappointed expression, and he says, "Well, Charles, I see that you have all C's here." And Charles says, "Yeah, well, I guess I'm average." And Barry lit into him and said, "Look, you cannot be average and play this music. All your heroes, Charlie Parker and Thelonious Monk and Bud Powell, these are not average men. You cannot play this music and be average." And, Charles says that talk changed his life. I mean, he tightened up his ship. He started to read. He made the honor roll. And, Charles now has become a very important alto saxophonist in the music himself. And you speak to Charles today, and he's an intellectual in many ways. And so, these are lessons, obviously, that go way beyond music. And
so let's talk about that education component, because you mentioned that, music was being taught in schools, which I think is something that we all sort of bemoan the fact that it's not there anymore. Was that unique to Detroit? Was there something different about the city of Detroit when it came to music education?
There were a couple of things. First of all, the schools were integrated here, which is important because even though there were other forces, including, a significant redlining and housing discrimination that sort of pushed people into more segregation, the schools were still, by law, segregated. And so that meant that African Americans got in really the same training that white musicians did. And at a flagship school like Cass Tech High School, which was essentially what we would think of today as an arts magnet high school, there were African Americans that went to that school and got great training. So people like Roland Hanna, the pianist, or Donald Byrd, the trumpet player, or Paul Chambers, bass player, Ron Carter, the bass player, and many others, all got first-rate music education at Cass. So the integrated schools made a difference, and also the fact that the schools were, from the 1920s on, renowned nationally for having great music education. And so what that meant was that kids really learned how to play their instruments. And that formal training becomes very important, particularly at mid-century, because what's happening nationally in the jazz scene is we have the mid-40s bebop, modern jazz is coming to the fore, sort of replacing the coming out of the swing era. And bebop is a more complicated music. It demands greater virtuosity. You have to be able to play faster. You have to be able to deal with more complicated rhythms. You have to have an understanding of harmony. And one of the reasons that Detroit becomes one of the first adapters of this new music, bebop, that Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker are inventing back in New York, Detroit is a really early adapter. Because one reason is because our musicians are so well trained. And so they have the technical know-how to deal with these ideas. And so Milt Jackson, the vibraphone player, or Lucky Thompson, a tenor saxophone player, Howard McGee, a trumpet player, all from Detroit, all become very important first-generation bebop players. So that's really important. And then a place like Cass Tech is kids are getting basically college-level music training. Half their day, if you majored in music at Cass Tech, half your day was spent in music. And you took music theory, and you took music history, and you took piano instruction. And if you played a string instrument, you also had to learn how to play a wind instrument. And so Ron Carter becomes one of the most influential bass players of all time, particularly with the Miles Davis group in the 1960s. Well, when Ron Carter is at Cass Tech, he's playing first he starts on cello, then he switches to bass and plays bass in the orchestra, but he also plays alto clarinet in the concert band. So The music, so it's a very high level. In fact, Gerald Wilson, who is an important big band composer and arranger and a trumpet player, who has leads probably the most important big band on the West Coast for most of the second half of the 20th century. Gerald is a Cass Tech graduate, and Gerald told me that he learned everything he needed to know basically at Cass Tech. And in fact, the level of training at Cass Tech was so high that when band leaders like Duke Ellington and Jimmy Lunsford and Count Basie came to Detroit to play, they would always go over to Cass Tech to scout for talent.
Yeah.
And so Gerald, for instance, that's how Gerald got to know Jimmy Lunsford, and he would then go over to where the Lunsford band was playing in Paradise Valley, and Gerald would hang out with the trumpet section for the week or two, however long that the band was in town. And then when Lunsford needed a trumpet player in 1939, he remembered this guy from Detroit at Cass Tech and calls Gerald. Actually, he didn't call. In fact, as I write in the book, Gerald was in the game so long that his call of destiny came by wire.
Wow.
And in fact, this is just as we were talking before about the slice of life of these characters. So Gerald is on the road with a territory band playing in Dayton, Ohio. In 1939, and Lunsford is in New York and needs a trumpet player. And so Lunsford finds out that Gerald is on the road with this band led by a guy named Chick Carter, and they're in Dayton, Ohio. And so Lunsford sends a telegram to the Black YMCA because in those days he knew that chances are that if the band wasn't staying at the YMCA, that the guys at the Black YMCA would know how to get in touch with somebody who was in Chick Carter's band. So the telegram goes there. Somebody gets it to Gerald, and the telegram says, I'd like you to join the band. I'll wire you money and a plane and a train ticket. And the next morning he goes off.
See, if I got an email like that, I'd totally think it was a scam.
Exactly. It doesn't
Right.
work that way. Now, let me ask you this. At Cass Tech, was it presented that you learn this and you can go have a career and a livelihood in music? Like, was it presented?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah,
that was the path.
Yeah, the school was designed to create professional musicians. And one thing that's I think is important to remember is that the Detroit public schools, first of all, they all had good music education. It wasn't just at Cass. They all had good music education. And our schools not only seeded this extraordinary jazz tradition, but it seeded Motown, right? The producers,
Absolutely.
the arrangers, the executives. I mean, Berry Gordy was a classmate of Barry Harris's in high school. So the songwriters, all those people came out of the Detroit public schools. The Detroit public schools seeded, if you look at the rosters of major orchestras all across the country, including the Detroit Symphony, there are Cass Tech graduates in those orchestras in the second half of the 20th century. There still are Cass Tech graduates in those orchestras. So, I say, if one of the quiet lessons of my book is that if you invest in public school music education, you can change the world.
Right.
And we know that in Detroit because we did.
Yeah, we've got the history to prove it. Yeah.
We've been talking largely about live performances. Where do studios and record labels come into all this?
This is interesting because what happens in the 1950s is that as these Detroiters begin to leave town and most of them go to New York, the way that the wider world begins to understand that something special is happening in Detroit is through the recordings that begin to be made in the middle and the late 1950s, and suddenly all these young Detroiters are showing up on these records. Remember, in the 1950s. we get the long playing record comes into fore around 1955, and all these independent labels sprout up on the East Coast, and in particular for jazz, Blue Note becomes a really critical label, but also Prestige and Savoy and some others, and Detroiters are all over those record labels. And so you cannot pick up a record that was made on the East Coast between 1955 and 1970 and not run into 1, 2, 3, sometimes 4 or more Detroiters. So, you begin to see in the late 50s people like Thad Jones, the trumpeter, and his brother Elvin, the drummer, and Donald Byrd on trumpet, and Hank Jones, the pianist, and Paul Chambers, the bass player, and Doug Watkins, bass player, and Louis Hayes, the drummer. All of these people, Yusef Lateef, all of these people start showing up on recordings, and you begin to see in the liner notes people start to refer to, the Detroit School, or this kind of thing is beginning to sort of get some acclaim. So the way that we begin to make our mark in the larger world comes through recordings, and the sound of jazz in this era. This is what we would call the hard bop era. So it's the idea of the music of bebop, taking the harmony and form and melodies coming out of the mid 40s, but also adding to that a kind of bluesy roots element to it. And now I'm thinking about the music of, say, Horace Silver or Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers. These are sort of some signature bands. And Detroiters come to have a really important place in that music because our musicians play with they're all polished craftsmen because they're all very well trained, but they really can play the blues and they can really swing, and there's a kind of musical intelligence to the way they play, in the way they phrase and how they use harmony, and there's kind of there's a versatility to them, and so. The scene just ate those kinds of musicians up because when you're making a 6-hour, recording date, you can't be messing around, right? You have to, you need to have stamina, you need to have focus, you need to have the skills, and the reliability to make those dates. And Detroiters were like to that manner born.
Mm-hmm. I think musicians are still known for that work ethic, right? I mean, and that kind of level of attaining that creativity, but the mastery.
Yeah, the Detroiters are our craft level is very high, but we are also creating individuals because in jazz, it's all about your own individual stamp and presenting your own personality in the music. And so we produce players, musicians we have from the beginning up until now who are highly rooted in the tradition, but also have this compulsion to find their own voice. And so what happens here is that we have musicians that sort of come off an assembly line, right? Except each one is part of a unified fleet, but each one is an individual. Mm-hmm. So it's a Tommy Flanagan or a Barry Harris or an Elvin Jones, or in contemporary times, a Marcus Belgrave or a Rodney Whitaker or a Bob Hurst.
Now, you started this conversation by talking about how Detroit was roaring at the time, and that led to a lot of the activity that was happening in jazz here. But obviously, in the 60s, that starts to turn around. The population starts to decline, and then in 67, we, of course, have the riots. What is the impact of all that on the jazz scene?
Well, one of the things that I talk about in the book, I'm always, I trace the influence of the diaspora and the influence of Detroiters out in the world, but I'm always keeping an eye on what's happening back home, and I'm kind of going back and forth to make sure that we're keeping up with what's happening back home, and the music is always connected to what's happening in the culture here. And so in the 1960s and 70s, as Detroit's fortunes reverse, there are a couple of important things that really help sustain the jazz tradition. one of the most important is we have a rise of self-determination efforts and cooperatives here in Detroit that come together, musicians basically doing it for themselves, creating concerts, making their own recordings, and creating a scene for themselves. And this is part of a larger zeitgeist, basically, that's happening throughout the country at that point, particularly within African-American communities. And so in jazz, we have in Chicago, there's a very well-known avant-garde group called the AACM, the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, which became very influential. And in St. Louis, there was the Black Arts Group. And in Los Angeles, there was similar organizations. And in New York, well, in Detroit, we have the two most important organizations are Strata Corporation and Tribe. And both of these organizations grow out of this self-determination effort. Tribe is associated with the co-founders are Wendell Harrison, a saxophone player who is still around. Wendell just last year was awarded the Kresge Eminent Artist Award, and so he's still doing it. Yeah. And the co-founder of Tribe was a trombone player named Phil Ranelin, who is still active. He's in Los Angeles now, but he was just in Detroit this summer performing at 80 years old. And so they start this organization where they again, they produce their own concerts. They produce records. And Tribe, actually, one of the most interesting things about Tribe is they started a magazine, Tribe Magazine, which had an Afrocentric focus and tackled very, serious, controversial issues: police brutality, abortion. The first issue of Tribe, the first issue of the magazine came out within just a couple of months, maybe 6 weeks before Roe v. Wade was actually decided. So, right on the edge here. And the magazine actually becomes so successful that, they sold advertising, had a base of freelancers. The magazine became so successful that Wendell Harrison, around 1977, decided he had to give up the magazine because it was taking away too much of his time from being a musician.
Wow.
But Tribe made some very raw, gritty, great recordings that are now highly prized on the collector's market. I mean, Tribe recordings, original pressings, literally can sell for $1,000 or more. Now, they've all been reissued many times, and you can hear the music, and it's it's got a vibe to it. It's interesting. It's there's a progressive edge to it. But there's also a little bit of early fusion and electricity, and you can hear some pop-oriented ideas in there, and a little bit of free jazz. It's very eclectic, and it's sort of omnivorous in its the way it takes all of these ideas and sort of filters them into a kind of a Detroit, very much a regional sound. It's connected to some larger ideas that are going on, but it's unique. So, Tribe becomes an important progenitor of music and a center for activity for a lot of musicians here. The Strata Corporation is kind of a different animal. Strata's idea, which was co-founded by a pianist named Ken Cox and a trumpet player named Charles Moore, tried to set up basically a little mini Motown. They sold stock to raise money to create a management agency, a record label, and a concert producing arm with a gallery where they produce concerts first over on Michigan Avenue and then later on Selden, right behind where the High School for the Performing Arts and Orchestra Hall are, 46 Selden. You can actually still see the number. That's where the Strata Gallery was. And now, in some ways, Strata failed in that they didn't raise very much money and weren't able to capitalize the way they needed to. And yet, they also managed to produce extraordinary concerts. So in Detroit in the early 70s, people like Charles Mingus and Chick Corea and Herbie Hancock and Ornette Coleman and many important jazz musicians who at that time, let's remember, were not household names and wouldn't weren't able to get gigs at places like Baker's, let's say. Mm-hmm. So so the Strata Gallery becomes an important center for these people to work in Detroit, and it becomes a place where Detroit musicians work, and it provides a kind of locus, right, of activity for the scene. So these things are very important in helping sustain the jazz in Detroit during those years. We also have to remember that the schools are still producing great jazz musicians, and then we come back to the importance of mentors, because in the 1970s, the trumpet player Marcus Belgrave becomes this extraordinarily important figure in Detroit who trains so many musicians that I have a major section in my book that's called Marcus Belgrave and His Children. Oh. And his children are the bass players, Rodney Whitaker and Bob Hurst, and the pianist Jerry Allen, the saxophonist Kenny Garrett, and the violinist Regina Carter, and the drummers Kareem Riggins and Gerald Wilson, Gerald Cleaver, and so all of these people come up under Marcus's wing, and we can talk a little bit more about that if we want to, but.
Well, I could go on forever just listening because I love hearing about the music in the context of history.
Exactly.
But we got to save some for the book. We got to give people a reason to read the book. So let's skip ahead to now.
Okay.
What is the state of the jazz scene in Detroit today?
Well, I think what's important here is that in some ways the scene is regenerating itself the way it always has. Young musicians have come up and come under the wing of important mentors. And so, for instance, in the book, I talk about two young kids, Marcus Elliott, a saxophone player, Michael Malice, a pianist, both of whom I sort of consider Marcus Belgrave's grandchildren because they studied with Marcus's students. They studied with people like Jerry Allen at the University of Michigan, Jerry came up under Marcus, or they studied with Rodney Whitaker at Michigan State, who came up under Marcus. And then they also were able to play with Marcus for a couple of years or so before Marcus's death. So they got some firsthand experience there. And we have other musicians now since Marcus has passed that have begun to play this mentorship role. So Marion Hayden, a bass player, and Ralph Armstrong, a bass player who's had a big career with Jean-Luc Ponty and Frank Zappa and John McLaughlin and the Mahavishnu Orchestra. And so Ralph, is always remained here in Detroit and hires young musicians. And again, adopts them in the same way, maybe not quite in the same way that Marcus, adopted these kids, but for Ralph and for Marion, mentoring young musicians, and for the community, mentoring young musicians is really important. When jazz musicians here in Detroit come across a talented kid, someone who's 10, 11, 12, 13 years old, and they see that kid that has potential, they immediately go to the parents and they say, your kid has some talent, and I would like to, here are the options, here are the programs, the after-school programs. Here's how we could, if you're interested, here's how maybe we could get a better instrument for your child. Here's how we could, Regina Carter, the great jazz violinist, told me in the book, she said, this community raised us. And this community does that. That thing about it takes a village, that idea, it takes a village to create jazz musicians. That's a powerful idea, and that happens here. I think, we still I wish we had more clubs. We have some clubs, but
Well, you've mentioned Bluebird several times now, and I know we had the Detroit Sound Conservancy on the podcast before, and they've got the stage and they're trying to restore the club, and now all of a sudden I'm like, oh, I get it.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and I do love that you can show up somewhere like Bert's Warehouse, in Eastern Market, and you can see Ralph Armstrong playing, and then every week for very little money or sometimes free. And people don't realize the history and what his career has been like and who he's taught. Or you can show up at the DIA on a Friday and see Galen McKinney on drums, or you can see these people play. It's really special.
When you go to Bert's, if James Carter, the great saxophonist, is in town, James, who basically grew up on the bandstand at Burt's, and is now one of the most famous, saxophone players we have in the music. When James is in town, he's always over there on a Thursday sitting in.
Yeah.
I mean, on any random night, you are likely to hear James play or any other great musicians coming through and hanging out and playing at Burt's. Cliff Bell's downtown has jazz every night of the week.
I have now been. I've made my
Yes.
first. That was on the
Every night,
staycation.
live
That
jazz,
was the list of places. To go.
Baker's Keyboard Lounge
That's next.
It's great.
is going all the time. Over on the east side in Grosse Pointe, the Dirty Dog Jazz Cafe has great bookings. So, and there are other places where the music happens. So
Let's talk about one of those places, because one of those places is obviously coming up this weekend.
Yes, we can hear
It's
a
the
whole
Detroit
lot.
Jazz Festival. Can you talk about this? Is the 40th year. Where does that fit into this whole narrative?
Yeah.
to me, what's important about the Jazz Festival is that it provides a focus once a year. This community comes together and puts on this remarkable event that's free to the public, and it provides, a jazz festival. It's not a street fair. A jazz festival is a cultural event that and a good one. It's not just a random set of bookings. It tells you something about a sense of place and what's happened and the culture from which it is springing. And what has always been important to the Detroit Jazz Festival is that we not only feature local musicians and we not only feature some of the most famous jazz musicians in the world here, but we also go out of our way to celebrate Detroit's jazz legacy, and we bring back some of those musicians who have come from here and have become world renowned, and they perform. And so there's a real sense of community that happens at the Detroit Festival that is unlike most other jazz festivals that you can go to. And so, for instance, this year there are a number of former Detroiters that are going to be playing. And I mean, I would point people to a couple of things. In particular, Ron Carter, the bass player, who we've mentioned a few times here. And Ron is now at 82, is still playing great and is the most recorded jazz musician on the planet. Ron has been on literally about 2,200, 2,300 recordings.
Wow.
Right?
Insane.
Which is insane.
Wow.
And Ron is playing duets with Pat Metheny, the great guitarist, and they first played duets together here at the Jazz Festival a few years ago when Ron was the artist in residence, and it was a major event in the wider jazz world, and they've now repeated these performances in some other places, but they're coming back and they're doing it again. When they did it here a few years ago, they were on a small stage, and it was a little crazy because there were 10,000 people that wanted to get into a space where only 2 could fit. Now they're going to be on a big stage. And that's a really important thing. I'd also point people to Kenny Garrett, great saxophone player who was Miles Davis's last saxophonist. Kenny Garrett is playing on Sunday evening. Ron Carter and Pat Metheny are Sunday afternoon. Sheila Jordan, a marvelous singer, is 90 years old, singing fantastically. I heard her a couple of weeks ago at Newport. You can't believe how great she's sounding. She's singing on Saturday. So those are a few of the things I would point to.
Good highlights.
Awesome. I'm all excited for it. I'm
Yes.
pumped. All right, Mark, one last thing to do before you get out of here. We're going to play a little game. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Here's how this works. We're going to ask you for a series of rapid-fire recommendations. Just tell us the first thing that comes to mind. Starting with this. Who was a Detroiter from the jazz world that everybody should know their name?
Well, I would argue that all 20, everybody in my book, that everybody should know
get the book.
that everyone should know their name. But let's point to Elvin Jones, the drummer, who is on the cover of my book. There's a beautiful color picture of Elvin on the cover of my book. But Elvin, one of the most influential drummers in the history of the music, particularly well known for playing with the John Coltrane Quartet in the 1960s, which is such a seminal band. And to me, Elvin was the soul of the spirit. That what everything that jazz can be and is about and can express gets expressed in the way Elvin plays. So I would recommend people to go to YouTube, type in Elvin Jones, and watch some things and just be mesmerized.
Do you have a favorite place in the Detroit area to go record shopping?
We are blessed in Detroit in that we live in used record store heaven.
True.
And so I tell my friends all over the country that they should come here. But I would point people to Dearborn Music in Dearborn. I would point people to Street Corner Music in Oak Park.
Yeah.
I would point people to Encore Records in Ann Arbor. I would point people to Hello Records and People's Records rather in Detroit. That's just for starters. There are others. Found Sound in Ferndale, UHF in Royal Oak. It's a long list, and I'm there every week making my rounds.
Are you?
So does jazz sound better on vinyl?
Everything sounds better on vinyl.
I was going to say, what doesn't sound better on vinyl?
You know, we haven't talked about radio much in this conversation. Do you have a favorite local radio DJ?
I have favorite radio stations.
Sure. Let's go
and
there.
so, I think WDET, WEMU, those two stations, and WRCJ all have jazz in their mix. So we are blessed here in Detroit. WEMU is all jazz out of Ypsilanti. WDET doesn't have as much jazz as they used to, but they have. But still, on the weekend, you can hear John Penny and Ed Love is still on, and WRCJ in the evenings is jazz. So we're lucky, and it tells you something about where you live. I mean, the great thing about radio, you guys know this better than anybody, radio is all about creating a sense of place, right? Yeah. It's all about that. And when you hear jazz in Detroit live, or when you hear it on the air, you can feel the community and the history kind of coming through that. And it's one of the reasons I love living here.
If you're not listening to jazz, which I know would be a crazy night for you, what's another type of music out of Detroit that you love?
Well, generally speaking, I'm a classical music person. Oh, okay. And so, because I was a classical music critic at the Detroit Free Press and have been a classical music critic as part of my life here, not only in Detroit but before that. And so contemporary classical music is very important to me, as is sort of all classical music. So, I mean, if we were to make my desert island list, there would be, there'd be lots of jazz on it, but there would also be Frank Sinatra, and there would also be, the Beethoven late string quartets.
Is that what the next book's going to be about?
Well, the next book, which I have just finished, is actually a history of Orchestra Hall in Detroit. And
Makes sense.
It's about the 100 years. Orchestra Hall in Detroit opened up on October 23rd, 1919. And so we are celebrating its 100th anniversary this year, and the Detroit Symphony commissioned me to write a book about this, and it will be published in October. It's beautiful.
Two books in 1 year?
Incredible.
I know, you're killing it.
I know. I mean, it's funny. I joke. It took me 55 years to write the first book, and it took me 5 months to write the second book. And, Orchestra Hall itself, it is a miracle. It went up in 6 months in 1919, and it took us just about that long to write this book. But it's beautiful. There's hundreds of pictures, and what's one thing that's really interesting about Orchestra Hall is that while the history of Orchestra Hall and the history of the Detroit Symphony are different, because the orchestra left in 1939. And so from 1941 to 1951, Orchestra Hall was known as the Paradise Theater, where it was the major venue for all the great African-American entertainers and bands. So Ellington and Basie and Lunsford and Sarah Vaughan and Billie Holiday and Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Billy Eckstine, all of those people played at the Paradise Theater. And so when you trace, and then of course Orchestra Hall almost meets its demise at the Wrecking Ball in 1970, and a grassroots movement is started by a bassoonist in the Detroit Symphony to save the hall, and a 20-year restoration goes over. So there's a great drama and saga in the story of Orchestra Hall. It's rise in a golden age, and then its fall, and then its resurrection that sort of mirrors the larger story of Detroit. So that's what the second book is.
That's awesome. I can't wait to read that. All right, last question. If you could have lunch with any Detroiter, dead or alive, who would it be?
Ooh, that is a hell of a question. That is a hell of a question. I mean, musician-wise, the very first thing that comes to mind is I would like to have lunch with Hank, Thad, and Elvin Jones, the three great brothers from Detroit. Thad, a very influential big band arranger, composer, leader, and trumpet player. Hank, the most elegant of pianists, and Elvin, this powerhouse drummer. I just think that the opportunity to sit down with the three brothers at once would be something special. There are other people I can think of. I mean, the painter Huey Lee Smith. I'm just now sort of trying to. On short notice, it's hard to come up with a whole bunch with these people. But
save it for your next book,
but
your third book.
The first thing that comes to mind historically is, boy, if I could get the three Jones brothers together, that would be a hell of a lunch.
Nice.
All right. I got to tell you, you're the perfect guest to have leading into the festival this weekend. Thank you so much for joining us. Mark Stryker, music and arts critic and reporter for the Detroit Free Press for over 20 years. The new book, the first new book, there's another one gone the way, is called Jazz from Detroit. Came out in July, and it's been a huge hit. I mean,
you sold out your first run already?
We've sold a ton of books, and the reviews have been great, and I'm very excited about it. I'm very excited about being the messenger for this great story of what our city has brought to the world.
Clearly needed to be told and put out there.
I think so. I think so.
People can go to jazzfromdetroit.com. That's the easiest way to find the book. And then all local booksellers.
Yeah, support your local bookstore.
Right, support your local bookstores. Go to Sources, go to Pages, go to BookBeat. If they don't have it in stock, they'll
get it.
They'll get it. I've been to a bunch of these stores. I've signed copies. I will also be signing copies and doing a presentation about the book at the Detroit Jazz Festival, the Detroit Toctet, Saturday afternoon at 4:45.
Awesome.
Saturday afternoon. Okay, great.
We'll look for it. Thank you so much. And until then, Detroit's moving.
Keep up.
The D Brief.
Your guide to Detroit's arts and entertainment scene.